My name is Torvin Kess, and before you get comfortable, let me warn you. I am not here to make my own people look good. I am not here to make anyone look good. Actually, I am here to tell you the truth. And the truth, my friend, is embarrassing. It is the kind of embarrassing that gets written into history books with a footnote that says, "Please do not repeat this," but we repeat it anyway. Every single year on the anniversary, someone reads this record aloud in front of the Dritch High Council. And every single year, half the room stares at the floor, and the other half pretends to cough so they do not have to look up. That is the story I am about to tell you. Not a tale of glory, not a tale of conquest, but a tale of one general with more pride than sense, one human woman who barely raised her voice, and 900 years of peace that started. And I want you to really sit with this with a bullet. So pour yourself something strong, settle in, and let me tell you how my empire tried to win an argument by pulling a trigger and lost so badly that we are still paying for it 9 centuries later. Let me set the stage first, because you need to understand exactly how full of ourselves we were. The Dritch Empire, at the time of this story, controlled 43 systems, a fleet that could blot out a sun if we felt dramatic that day, and an ego so large it should have had its own gravitational pull. We had fought the Verity into submission. We had absorbed the Kovac cluster without losing a single capital ship. We looked at the galactic map and saw one small blue, mostly water planet on the edge of nowhere, populated by soft, hairless, embarrassingly short-lived creatures who called themselves humans. And we thought, how quaint. They had colonized a handful of systems. They had a fleet that looked, and I say this with love now, like a child's toy collection compared to ours. And they had the audacity to sign a border agreement with us as if they were equals. We signed it anyway because, frankly, humans were more useful to trade with than to bother fighting, and because our economists insisted that human coffee exports alone justified peaceful relations. I am not joking. Coffee. An empire that conquered 43 systems nearly went to war over trade tariffs on a bitter brown liquid. The ceasefire zone where our story takes place was called the Ashvane Corridor, a neutral strip of space between our territory and theirs, patrolled jointly, monitored constantly, and treated by both sides as the world's most awkward waiting room. Neither side trusted the other completely. Neither side wanted to be the one who started something. And into that tense, uncomfortable little pocket of space, humanity sent a woman named Elena Rhodes to serve as their ranking commander and chief negotiator. When we received her file, my superiors laughed. Actual laughter in a briefing room over a woman who stood at what humans consider average height. With graying hair, she refused to die. No visible augmentations, no imposing title beyond commander, and a service record that, and I want you to notice this detail because it matters later, was almost entirely free of combat casualties on either side of any conflict she had ever managed. General Vi, whom you will come to despise almost as much as I did, looked at that file and said, and I quote directly from the transcript because I want you to appreciate the full weight of his stupidity, "They sent us a librarian." She was not a librarian. She was, and it took us far too long to understand this, the most dangerous person in that entire sector. And she never once raised her voice to prove it. I met her briefly during the early rounds of border negotiations, standing off to the side as an archivist recording the proceedings for the council. She walked into that negotiation chamber wearing a plain gray uniform with no medals, no decorations, nothing to signal rank except a small insignia at her collar. She carried a single data pad instead of the usual entourage of aides and advisors that Dritch officers dragged along like security blankets. Our delegation arrived with 12 officials. She arrived with 2. One was her translator, and the other, we later learned, was there mostly to make sure she ate lunch because apparently she had a habit of forgetting. I remember thinking, this will be quick. I remember thinking, we will finish this negotiation before dinner and go home feeling very proud of ourselves. I was wrong on both counts. And honestly, looking back, I should have known better the moment she sat down, folded her hands, and said nothing, while our senior negotiator spent 10 straight minutes reminding everyone in the room how many systems the Dritch Empire controlled. She let him finish. She let him finish completely. Every word, every boast, every not-so-subtle threat wrapped in diplomatic language. And when he was done, puffed up and pleased with himself, she simply said, "That is a lot of systems to be worried about one small ceasefire zone." The room went quiet not because it was rude. It was not even close to rude. It was almost polite. But because it was true and everyone in that room knew it was true, and nobody had said it out loud until she did. Our negotiator sputtered something about strategic necessity. She nodded, made a small note on her data pad, and moved the conversation forward as if nothing had happened. That was Elena Rhodes. She did not fight with volume. She fought with precision, and precision, my friends, cuts far deeper than shouting ever could. I remember another session a few weeks after that first exchange when our delegation tried a different approach entirely. They brought maps. Enormous, detailed, beautifully rendered star charts showing every system under Dritch control, unrolled dramatically across the negotiating table, as if the sheer size of the display alone might finally convince her to fold. Rhodes looked at the map for a long moment, long enough that our negotiators started exchanging pleased little glances with each other. Then she asked quite politely, how many of those systems actually produced anything worth trading, and how many of them were simply there to look impressive on a map? Nobody answered her. Nobody could answer her because the honest answer would have undercut the entire point of bringing the map in the first place. She let the silence sit there for exactly as long as it needed to sit, thanked everyone for their time, and moved on to the next agenda item, as if she had not just quietly dismantled an entire afternoon of careful theater. She had a habit, too, of asking questions that sounded simple on the surface but somehow managed to corner an entire room within a single sentence. During one particularly tense session over resource-sharing rights along the corridor, our senior economic advisor spent nearly 20 minutes explaining in exhaustive technical detail why Dritch vessels required exclusive mining access to a particular asteroid field. Rhodes waited until he finished, nodded thoughtfully, and asked whether that same logic would apply if human vessels requested exclusive access to a comparable field on the other side of the corridor. It should have been an easy question. It was not. Our advisor spent another 10 minutes trying to explain why the situations were different. And by the end of it, even I, sitting quietly in the back with my recording equipment, could tell he no longer believed his own argument. Rhodes simply wrote something on her data pad, thanked him for the clarification, and left the resource question open for further discussion. She did that constantly. She never forced a concession. She simply made it obvious patiently, repeatedly, exactly where the concession needed to be. Happen and let us arrive there ourselves, which somehow felt worse than if she had simply demanded it outright. Over the following months, negotiations continued, session after session, and each time our delegation walked in convinced they would finally outmaneuver her. And each time they walked out having conceded something they swore they never would. She never gloated. That was honestly the most infuriating part. A Dritch officer who wins an exchange makes sure everyone in the room knows it. Makes sure it is written into the historical record with appropriate flourish. Rhodes would simply thank everyone for their time, gather her single data pad, and leave, looking for all the world like she had just finished a mildly interesting staff meeting rather than dismantled an empire's negotiating position, piece by piece. I started, against my better judgment, admiring her. I was supposed to be a neutral observer recording events for the council archive, but I found myself looking forward to the sessions just to see what she would say next. General Carson Vi did not share my admiration. Vi was, by Dritch standards, an impressive specimen. Tall, broad-shouldered, decorated with more medals than his uniform could comfortably hold, and possessed of a voice that could rattle windows in the next building over. He had built his entire career on the idea that Dritch's strength was self-evident, that our size and our weapons and our history of conquest spoke for themselves, and that anyone who failed to be sufficiently intimidated by us was either a fool or an enemy. He attended the negotiations as a military advisor, technically outranked by the civilian delegation, but everyone in that room understood who actually held power in that ceasefire zone. And it was not the diplomats in their fine clothes. It was Vi and the fleet sitting quietly behind him. He hated Rhodes almost from the first session. Not because she was rude to him. She never was. But because she refused to be afraid of him, and Vi had never, not once in his long and decorated career, encountered someone who simply refused to be afraid. He would lean forward during meetings, drop his voice into that low, rumbling register meant to remind everyone exactly how large he was, and Rhodes would simply meet his eyes, wait for him to finish, and respond as if he had asked a perfectly reasonable question in a perfectly reasonable tone. It drove him, and I watched this happen in real time across dozens of sessions, slowly, quietly, insane. The breaking point came during what should have been the easiest session of the entire negotiation, a ceremonial signing to finalize updated trade terms along the corridor. Low stakes, mostly symbolic, the kind of meeting where everyone shakes hands, smiles for the cameras, and goes home early. Vi attended, as he always did, standing near the back of the room in full ceremonial armor. And something about that day, something about watching Rhodes walk in calm, unbothered, utterly unimpressed by 9 centuries of Dritch military tradition on display around her, finally cracked whatever restraint he had left. He convinced himself, and I have read his private logs, recovered later during the tribunal, so I know this is not exaggeration. He genuinely convinced himself that Rhodes was not simply a skilled negotiator. He decided she was a deliberate insult, a calculated humiliation sent by humanity specifically to make the Dritch Empire look weak in front of the wider galaxy. And he decided, in the quiet, festering corner of his own pride, that the only way to restore Dritch honor was to remove her. There were warnings if anyone had cared to look for them. 2 weeks before the signing ceremony, Vi requested through channels that were technically legitimate, but rarely used for such purposes, a full security review of the ceremonial chamber, citing vague concerns about, and I am reading directly from the request, unassessed risk factors associated with the human delegation. Nobody flagged it as unusual because Vi requested security reviews constantly. It was simply part of his personality, the kind of paranoid, controlling habit that decorated generals are rarely questioned about. He also, in the days leading up to the ceremony, had several private conversations with junior officers under his command. Conversations that survivors of his staff later described during the tribunal as strange, clipped, and unusually philosophical for a man not known for philosophy. He asked one young lieutenant, apparently without context, whether she believed an empire could remain an empire if it allowed itself to be embarrassed in front of lesser species. She said she did not know how to answer that question. He told her that was, in his exact words, the correct answer because there was only one answer, and it did not involve embarrassment. Nobody thought to report the conversation. Why would they? Generals talk in riddles sometimes. It is practically a hobby among the highest ranks of Dritch command. And nobody imagined those riddles were the last confession of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. I want to be very clear about something before I continue. Nobody ordered this. No council authorized this. No official Dritch policy called for violence against a diplomatic official during a ceremonial signing under active ceasefire protections. This was one man, one deeply insecure, deeply prideful man who decided that his own wounded ego was worth more than 900 years of history was about to prove it was not. The signing ceremony began the way these things always begin. Tediously. Speeches were given, documents were displayed, photographers, or whatever passed for photographers among the various delegations present, adjusted their equipment along the perimeter of the room. Rhodes stood at the podium opposite our senior diplomat, datapad in hand, waiting patiently through yet another lengthy Dritch speech about strength and tradition and the glory of the empire. And if she was bored, and I suspect she was, she never once let it show on her face. When the speeches finally ended, the 2 delegations approached the center of the room for the ceremonial handshake that would mark the formal conclusion of the agreement. A gesture as old as diplomacy itself, a gesture meant to say, whatever our differences, we choose peace today. Rhodes extended her hand. Vi stepped forward from the back of the room, drew his sidearm in one smooth, practiced motion that told me later he had rehearsed this moment more than once in private, and fired a single shot directly into her chest before a single guard in that room had time to react. I need you to understand what that moment sounded like, because words genuinely fail me here. There was the shot itself, sharp and impossibly loud in a room built for polite conversation. And then there was silence, the kind of silence that feels like it has physical weight, like it is pressing down on your chest and refusing to let you breathe. Rhodes did not scream. I remember that clearly even now, all these centuries later. She simply staggered, her hand still half extended toward our diplomat, and fell. And the data pad she had carried into every single session slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor with a sound that seemed, In that frozen, horrible moment, louder than the gunshot itself. Chaos followed almost immediately. Human security officers moved with a speed and coordination that frankly terrified everyone in that room. Weapons drawn, forming a protective perimeter around their fallen commander within seconds, shouting commands to each other in clipped, urgent tones. Dritch guards froze, uncertain, looking to officers who had no idea what to do because nothing in 900 years of military doctrine had prepared them for one of their own generals shooting an unarmed diplomat during a ceremonial handshake. Vi himself stood there, weapons still raised, and for one brief, telling moment, he looked almost satisfied, as if he believed he had just restored Dritch honor. That expression did not last long. I watched it crumble into something closer to confusion, and then finally something that looked very much like fear as the full weight of what he had just done began to settle over the room. Human medics reached Rhodes within moments, and I remember, even in the panic, being struck by how calm they remained, how practiced their movements were, as if some part of them had trained for exactly this kind of nightmare and simply refused to let training slip even now. What happened to her in the following hours, whether she lived, whether she was rushed to some hidden medical facility we never had access to, remains, even to this day, one of the most closely guarded secrets in human military history. What I can tell you is what happened next in that room, in that corridor, in the following hours and days, because that is the part of this story that actually matters. Human forces did not fire back. I want you to sit with that for a moment because everyone in that room, myself included, braced for immediate, overwhelming retaliation. We had just watched our own general shoot a human commander in cold blood during a diplomatic ceremony. An act so far outside every rule of engagement that even our own guards did not know how to respond. And every Dritch officer present fully expected human ships to appear over the corridor within the hour. Weapons hot, demanding blood for blood. That is how we would have responded. That is how Vi himself, in his own twisted logic, seemed to expect them to respond, because a response like that would have made sense to him. It would have fit neatly into his understanding of how strength answers insult. Instead, human forces sealed the chamber, secured their wounded commander, and withdrew calmly, methodically, without firing a single shot, without a single raised voice, without a single ship moving out of formation along the corridor. And that silence, that terrible, controlled, deliberate silence, frightened the Dritch command far more thoroughly than any counterattack ever could have. General Vi could have understood a war. War was a language he spoke fluently. What he could not understand, what none of us could understand in those first confused hours, was an enemy who had every justification imaginable to retaliate and simply chose not to. Because that meant they were planning something else entirely. And nobody, not the Council, not the Fleet Command, not Vi himself, had any idea what that something else might be. I spent those 3 days of silence doing the only thing an archivist knows how to do in a crisis, which is sit very still and watch everyone around me slowly lose their minds. Our Fleet Command doubled patrols along the corridor, certain, absolutely certain, that human ships were massing somewhere just out of sensor range, preparing an overwhelming strike that would arrive without warning. Council members held emergency session after emergency session, arguing over whether to issue a formal apology, a formal denial, or simply pretend the entire incident had been some kind of unfortunate training accident that had gotten wildly out of hand. Nobody could agree on anything because nobody had ever had to manage a crisis like this. A crisis built not on the threat of violence, but on the complete absence of it. And the not knowing, I promise you, was so much worse than knowing would have been. At least a fleet massing on the border gives you something to prepare for. Silence gives you nothing but your own imagination, running in increasingly terrified circles. And ours ran plenty. We found out 3 days later, and it turned out to be worse in the long run than any war could have been. Humanity did not send warships. Humanity sent evidence. They released, through every open communication channel available across the galactic community, a complete recording of the entire signing ceremony, captured from multiple angles by their own security systems, showing with perfect, undeniable clarity exactly what had happened. There was General Vi drawing his weapon. There was the shot. There was Commander Rhodes, unarmed, hand extended in a gesture of peace, falling to the floor of a room specifically designated as neutral, protected ground under terms the Dritch Empire itself had signed. They did not editorialize. They did not add dramatic narration or emotional appeals. They simply presented the footage, time-stamped and verified, alongside the original text of the ceasefire agreement, highlighting exactly which protections had been violated, and let every civilization watching draw their own conclusions. The reaction across the wider galactic community was immediate and, for the Dritch Empire, catastrophic. Trade partners who had spent decades cultivating relationships with us suddenly discovered urgent reasons to renegotiate terms. Neutral systems that had remained carefully diplomatic on the subject of Dritch expansion suddenly found their voices condemning the attack in increasingly public forums. Even our own allies, species who had fought alongside us in previous conflicts, quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with an empire that had just been caught, on recording, murdering an unarmed diplomat during a ceremony meant to celebrate peace. Within a single galactic month, 3 separate trade agreements collapsed. Within 2 months, the Verity, who had never forgiven us for their earlier defeat, began openly courting alliances with human systems, using the incident as evidence that Dritch strength was built on intimidation rather than honor. And through all of it, humanity never fired a single shot. They did not need to. They had learned something that it took my own people 900 years to truly understand. That in a galaxy full of watching eyes, shame is a far more effective weapon than any fleet. Because a fleet can be destroyed. But a recording, once released, lives forever, replayed endlessly, taught in history classes, quoted in diplomatic negotiations centuries later by people who were not even born when the shot was fired. Humanity did not win that confrontation through force. They won it by simply telling the truth loudly, clearly, and permanently to an audience that could never be made to unsee it. I remember watching the reactions roll in from other species across the sector, one by one, over the course of that first week, and it was, even now, one of the strangest experiences of my long career. The Kovac delegations, who had spent decades quietly resenting Dritch occupation of their old territory, released statements that were polite on the surface and absolutely gleeful underneath. The diplomatic equivalent of watching a bully trip in front of the entire schoolyard. Independent trade guilds who had no particular loyalty to anyone simply began quietly rerouting shipments away from Dritch-controlled space. Not as punishment exactly, just as basic risk management, because nobody wants to sign contracts with an empire currently starring in the galaxy's most widely circulated diplomatic scandal. Even species who had never had any contact with either the Dritch Empire or humanity found the footage, watched it, and formed opinions because that is the strange, permanent nature of recorded evidence in an interconnected galaxy. It does not stay contained. It spreads quietly, endlessly, into corners you never expected it to reach, and there is no fleet large enough to stop that particular kind of invasion. General Vi's downfall, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic by comparison, though I will admit I found a certain grim satisfaction in watching it unfold. The Dritch Council, faced with mounting diplomatic isolation and increasingly public condemnation, needed someone to blame, and Vi conveniently had already done the work of implicating himself on recording. He was stripped of rank within the month. His medals were removed in a ceremony that I am told was almost as humiliating as the crime that caused it, and he was put on trial before a tribunal desperate to prove to the rest of the galaxy that the Dritch Empire did not, as a matter of official policy, condone shooting diplomats at peace ceremonies. Vi, for his part, never once expressed remorse during the entire proceeding. He insisted right up until his sentencing that he had defended Dritch honor, that history would eventually vindicate him, that a strong empire does not apologize for strength. History did not vindicate him. History remembers him as the single worst diplomatic mistake in the recorded existence of the Dritch Empire. And honestly, I think that legacy suits him rather perfectly. I attended most of the tribunal sessions myself, recording testimony for the archive, and I will admit there was a particular satisfaction in watching officers who had once stood a little straighter whenever Vi entered a room now testify against him with barely concealed relief in their voices. One witness, a young tactical officer named Doran Ash, described the moment after the shot with a level of detail that stuck with me for years afterward. He said Vi had turned to him, weapon still smoking, and asked quite calmly whether he had done the right thing, as if he genuinely expected reassurance in that moment, as if 900 years of Dritch tradition could somehow be summoned to comfort a man who had just shot an unarmed woman in the chest during a peace ceremony. Ash said he did not answer. He said there was nothing in his training that had prepared him for a question like that. And he simply stood there staring until security arrived to take Vi into custody. That testimony alone, delivered in a flat, exhausted voice by a young officer who clearly wished he had never been in that room, did more to convict Vi in the eyes of the council than any physical evidence ever could have. What followed his conviction, though, is the part of this story that actually earns it a place in our history books beyond simple embarrassment. Facing total diplomatic collapse, the Dritch Council entered negotiations with humanity from a position weaker than anything our empire had experienced in centuries. And Elena Rhodes, who had survived the attack against what every physician who examined her medical scans later called overwhelming odds, returned to the negotiating table herself to help draft the terms of what would eventually become known as the Ashvane Accord. I attended those final sessions as well, still recording, still watching, and I remember being struck by how little bitterness she carried into that room. She could have demanded punishment far beyond what our own council had already imposed. She could have demanded territory, resources, public humiliation stretched out over years. I remember Threll Osk still visibly bracing himself, still expecting the worst, asking her outright what reparations humanity intended to demand, prepared, I suspect, to offer territory, resources, anything the council believed might satisfy an aggrieved power looking to extract maximum advantage from a moment of total leverage. It would have been the Dritch way. Certainly, it is what we would have demanded had the positions been reversed, and everyone in that room, myself included, fully expected Rhodes to press her advantage while she had it, because that is simply how these things are supposed to work. She asked instead for something far more permanent. She asked for documentation, complete, unbreakable, publicly accessible documentation of exactly what had happened, exactly why it had happened, and exactly what consequences would follow if anything like it ever happened again. All of it built into a treaty that could never quietly be forgotten or reinterpreted by future generations eager to rewrite history in their own favor. I sat in on the final drafting session myself, and I remember being surprised, given everything that had happened, by how quiet and businesslike the whole affair turned out to be. Rhodes arrived with the same single data pad she had always carried, the same plain uniform, the same patient, unhurried manner that had unsettled our delegation from the very first session all those months earlier. And if she carried any visible resentment toward the people sitting across from her, she never once let it surface. Our council representatives, by contrast, looked shaken in a way I had never seen from Dritch officials before, stripped of the usual bluster, answering her questions carefully, almost cautiously, like students who had failed an important examination and were desperate not to fail a second one. At one point, our lead negotiator, a cautious, mild-mannered official named Threll Osk, who had inherited the position only after Vi's disgrace made the previous negotiator's position untenable, asked Rhodes directly why she was not demanding harsher terms, given everything the Dritch Empire had done. She considered the question for a moment, the way she considered most questions, unhurried and thoughtful, and said that harsh terms fade. People move on from harsh terms within a generation or two, find ways to resent them, find ways to justify breaking them eventually. She said she was not interested in terms that would fade. She was interested in terms that would last. And the only thing she had ever seen last across every negotiation she had ever conducted was the simple, permanent, undeniable truth of what had actually happened, recorded clearly enough that no future leader, however ambitious, could quietly pretend it away. That is why the peace held for 900 years. And honestly, it is the smartest thing anyone did in this entire miserable saga. Most treaties are built on trust. And trust, as anyone who has studied history knows, tends to erode over time, generation by generation, until eventually someone convinces themselves the old agreements no longer apply. The Ashvane Accord was not built on trust. It was built on documented, permanent, inescapable shame, recorded in such thorough and public detail that no future Dritch leader, however proud, however ambitious, could ever quietly pretend the incident had not happened or that its lessons no longer mattered. Every cadet in our military studies that recording. Every diplomat entering training watches Commander Rhodes extend her hand and fall, watches General Vi's face shift from satisfaction to horror in the span of a few seconds, and understands viscerally, in a way no lecture could ever teach, exactly what happens when pride is allowed to override every rule a civilization claims to value. I have sat in on those training sessions myself, more times than I care to count, watching young cadets, barely old enough to hold a commission, go completely silent the first time they see that recording play out in full. Some of them cry quietly, trying not to let the others notice. Nobody mocks them for it anymore. Not since the incident. Not since an entire empire learned exactly how much a single moment of unchecked pride can cost. The instructors let the silence sit there afterward, uncomfortable and heavy, for exactly as long as it needs to sit, because that silence, I have come to believe, teaches far more effectively than any lecture ever could. Fear of repeating that shame kept the piece running smoother and longer than any fleet standing guard along the border ever could have. It is worth mentioning, too, that Rhodes herself, once she recovered enough to return to active duty, never sought public recognition for what she had built. She repeatedly declined offers from Human Command to have monuments constructed in her honor, statues, named facilities, the usual trappings that most commanders in her position would have accepted without hesitation. She served quietly along the corridor for another decade before retiring. And when historians asked her late in her life how she felt about a treaty bearing the name of the very corridor where she had nearly died, she reportedly said, "That peace does not need a hero attached to it to be worth keeping. It just needs enough people willing to remember why it mattered in the first place." And this line has been repeated in more diplomatic textbooks across the galaxy than I could possibly count. I have always found that particular quote almost unbearably human in the way that only the best human philosophy tends to be. Simple on the surface and nearly impossible to fully live up to. There is a strange kind of humility in that. One that took my own people generations to even begin to understand, let alone practice ourselves. We built our entire civilization on the idea that strength needed to be displayed constantly, loudly, in ceremonies and medals and fleets stretched across the sky for effect. Rhodes built something that outlasted all of it using nothing but patience, precision, and a willingness to let the truth speak for itself instead of forcing the room to listen to her. It is, I think, the single most humbling lesson our empire has ever been forced to absorb. And we absorbed it the hardest possible way. One bullet, one recording, and 900 years of quiet, permanent shame. So here we are, 900 years later, and I am an old archivist finishing the same story I have told 100 times before, and I still find myself shaking my head at the sheer, spectacular stupidity of it all. One man's wounded pride. One moment of violence against an unarmed woman who never once raised her voice against him. And it very nearly cost my entire empire everything it had spent centuries building. And yet somehow, out of that darkest possible moment, humanity built something that outlasted the very empire that tried to destroy it. Elena Rhodes never sought vengeance. She sought proof. Permanent, undeniable proof. And in doing so, she turned a bullet meant to silence her into the foundation of the longest peace either of our civilizations has ever known. We never fully lived it down. And honestly, I do not think we deserve to. Every year on this anniversary, someone reads this record aloud before the council. And every year, the room goes quiet in exactly the same way it went quiet the moment that shot was fired. Some lessons, I suppose, are meant to sting a little every single time you learn them again. And if you ask me, an old archivist with nothing left to protect and no particular loyalty left to defend, I would say humanity did not just win that day. They rewrote what winning even means, and the rest of the galaxy has been quietly taking notes ever since.